Well, I'd like to start by expressing my admiration for Bruce and Maria's work, and point out that they've merged two things that are especially difficult to bring into the lives of our K-12 students. You know, getting them outdoors, as one of the commenters mentioned, is a real challenge that I suspect the people in this audience are well aware of. But also to show them how evolution is relevant and important in their lives. So, you know, without saying the word, that E word anywhere in their presentation, there were trees, cladograms up there, and that's evolution, and that's really cool stuff. And I think that the merging of those two ideas in your projects is outstanding. And the second thing I wanted to say about their talk is to Maria and all you other people who are doing that, please send your people to me at Hofstra. We need them in our classes. Some of the stuff you were doing there is what we teach in our freshman level college classes. And if you can send them to, man, we could start off with that. Oh, it would be really, really, really wonderful. Some of my graduate students would probably like to see how to do that. I'm flattered to be invited a second time to speak here. So I don't know whether that means they're running so short on speakers they're cycling through us again, or whether I should really take it as flattery that, or maybe because I'm local and easy to talk into these sorts of things. But in any case, a lot of you who know me primarily because of my work with turtles. And I'd like to point out two things. One is I love to work with turtles, but also that I do work with a variety of other vertebrates. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the lizard work that I've done today, but also I'm getting more and more involved with working with mammals these days. And so if you were here last year, you heard about the coyote projects that are taking place in New York City and also following the coyotes onto Long Island. And I'm pretty heavily involved in those as well. And maybe in a year or two, I'll be up here a third time, and I'll be ready to talk about some of the results we've had working with mesocarnivores and maybe coyotes here on Long Island. So you know, we run a full-service vertebrate ecology lab at Hofstra. So I do more than work on turtles. But I do want to talk about the Italian wall lizard work that we've done, and I think there's some interesting stories there. So let me start by setting the context there. You know, these are invasive species. They are certainly not native to Long Island, in fact, not native to North America. And this is a topic of a huge amount of interest, and I suspect a lot of interest to people here in this audience. Are well aware that invasive species get a lot of press. We pay a lot of attention to them. There are people here who've spent a significant amount of their time dealing with invasive species, and you know, they come from a variety of sources, and it's not just a Long Island problem, of course. These are problems pretty much everywhere in the world. Every continent, every ecosystem essentially has problems with invasive species. And if you look at the reviews of invasive species, for the most part, they focus on a number of sources for them. So you know, we have sources from like purple loosestrife that are you know, plants that are brought over because they're pretty, or you know, they serve a nice landscape function, and then they get loose. We also have lots and lots of agricultural escapes. So giant reed, which is grown for biofuels, is a known invasive and is a big problem in lots of places. And people want to actively plant it because we want to farm it for biofuels, but you know, it has this big risk. We know a lot about it as an invasive. And then there's, you know, the stowaways, you know, and we have lots of examples of those, particularly in ballast water and that sort of thing. The sorts of things where we know that is a major source of invasives. But there are lots of other sources of invasives as well, and the Italian wall lizards are not in any of these. So there are lots of other sources of invasives that we need to monitor as well. We know that invasives can be really, really important. And you know, one of the reasons, or you know, the reasons that we pay a lot of attention to invasives is that, you know, there's so much we don't know about how communities function that when we throw, you know, a new species in there, we have lots and lots and lots of concerns about the sorts of effects they might have. We know that there are plenty of examples of invasives that compete with native species, that predate native species, that parasitize native species. species. We know that lots of invasive species change disturbance patterns, and just as ecology is starting to grapple with what disturbances are all about and how to understand them and how to manage them, then we bring invasive species in that, who make disturbances more common or less common to change hydrological cycles, and in these ways change the environment that our native species are dealing with. And we know plenty of examples now of invasive species that hybridize with the native species, or that change native environments in all sorts of subtle ways. And it's always remarkable when people learn that so many of the earthworms that we encounter on a regular basis are invasives. And not only are they invasives, but they're changing the forests in dramatic ways, but you don't see it, unless you're really, really looking at it, you don't see it. And so, some of our biggest concerns about invasives are the things that are hard to detect. And, we're not very good at seeing those things. And so, they're cause for a lot of worry, and justifiably so. And then really the argument that, we hope will have an impact on some people, if you're not concerned about the forest understory changing because you're letting your fishing worms loose, out in the woods when you're done fishing for the day, then, some people might be persuaded by the fact that it costs us a lot of money. So every one of us pays a lot of money in our utility bills and our taxes and all those kinds of things dealing with invasives. And there haven't been really recent updates of these estimates, so certainly these are underestimates. But certainly in the US alone, we spend $125 billion every year dealing with invasives. Now that includes things like invasives that change rangeland, so it's more difficult to raise livestock, and change and weeds that get into farm fields, and we have to deal with that. So, but it's lots of other invasives as well. A significant fraction of the money that we spend on protecting rare and endangered species has to do with dealing with the invasive species that affect them as well. So if the changes in the forest don't affect you, if the changes in the fire regimes don't affect you, if none of those other things matter to you, if maybe only your pocketbook or your wallet is what affects you, okay, well there we got you there too. And just as an example of that, the emblematic, the iconic example of that is the brown tree snake and its invasions of Guam, which has caused incredible biodiversity loss of endemic species in Guam. And you and I have spent money through the federal government dealing with this problem and working to prevent the snake from getting into, for example, Hawaii, where it would cause similar problems. So if none of the rest of that works, then we ought to be worried about the effect that it has on our dollars. So with all that backdrop of scary stories about bad invasives, let me introduce to you a lovely little lizard. All right, so these are Italian wall lizards, and I'd like to start by getting some name stuff all straightened around here. They're called Italian wall lizards. They're also called ruin lizards. And the Italians laugh when we call them these different names, because they go by lots and lots of different names in Italy, but not either of those. There are actually two species involved here. These are sister taxa. This is Podarcus sicula and Podarcus muralis. For the most part, I'm going to be talking about just sicula today, but a couple of places I'm going to throw muralis in there as well. They are, of course, very similar in lots of ways, but they're different in important ways, and I'll try to distinguish between them as we go. But they are very lovely lizards, as you can see here. They're bright green, and especially in the spring, as they come out of hibernation and the males are getting ready to do courtship and battle with each other and all that kind of stuff. Their colors are exceptionally bright. A lot of color variation, but a lot of them will have bright blue, turquoise spots along the sides and get really, really nice. They don't always pose with a flower behind them. But when I first came to Long Island 20 years ago, when I was interviewing for the job at Hofstra, here I'm just finishing up a postdoc at University of Michigan, and my concern as an ecologist moving into a suburban area, and I was trained and did all my field work in much more rural areas. My concern was, am I going to be able to, do the kind of field research that I'm trained to do in an urban setting, an urban suburban setting? Am I going to be able to do that? And more importantly, to generate the papers I need to get tenure, right? These are the important things that a hire for a faculty position has to ask. Am I going to be able to generate those papers? And so that means, are there easy things for me to do that will produce data that I can publish and hopefully answer some interesting and meaningful questions as well, but at the very least, publish papers. And so after I did all the formal stuff, after the, well, can you teach? Can you, do you like this? All that kind of stuff. After all the interviews when they quizzed me and all that sort of thing, got all done, and so I guess I'd satisfied at least the minimum for all those things. And then the department chair says, okay, so your plane doesn't leave until, for another 6 hours. It's a nice spring afternoon. What would you like to do? What would you like to see on Long Island in your hours that remain here? And I said, take me to the lizards. Take me where the lizards are. Because I had read in the herp journals and all this kind of stuff that Long Island had wall lizards. And I had already pegged that if I was going to get tenure, and it was going to be probably, at least partially, on the basis of wall lizards, because where they exist, they're very, very poorly studied. And to a natural historian, what that means is that anything I discover is publishable. And every one of those papers is, a step toward tenure. So she took me out to, actually, she didn't know, most of the other members of our department didn't know where the lizards were. One of our department members, some of you might remember Ken Erb, was a guy who spent a lot of time just walking sidewalks and in the area for exercise. And he knew Garden City, and he said, I know where the lizards are. He directed us to neighborhoods. We walked the sidewalks up and down, people's houses were walking the city streets, and there were lizards running all over the place. And as soon as I saw the first batch of them, I can get tenure here. And I can do this. And so I started a research program soon after that, and I want to point out that Rob Alvey, who's here somewhere, was instrumental in helping me get started on some research sites. And I had plenty of history catching lizards in other places, so I knew lots of ways to do it. One of them is to noose them, as you see me here. I'm pretty sure Rob took this picture. Thank you. Good, good. Thanks for confirming, and as I say it. So I put that picture in there thinking that was probably one that you had taken. Anyway, so he and I worked together for a little bit, and then I pretty much took off on my own. And so most of the rest of what I'm going to tell you today is the result of what started that day. And I'm going to give you the punchline here before I get to the rest of this, and that is to point out that I did successfully conduct a number of studies on lizards, and I hope you find them interesting. And I did publish those papers, and I did get tenure. And as a result of all that, I attribute my getting tenure to these lizards. So they will always have a very fond place in my heart. And as an acknowledgement of that, I had a tattoo on my left shoulder here, which I'm not going to show you, but if you really want to see, I will. And the reason that I have that particular picture of it with a lizard posing on it is that there's a book called Science Inc., which you'll have to look up on Amazon now if you don't already know about it, which has a collection of tattoos that scientists have of their subject matter. And it's amazing. I got to tell you, some people are nuts about this. But in any case, I mean, there are whole freshwater ecosystems across somebody's back and that kind of stuff. Way more pain than I'm willing to put up with. This tattoo and this lizard is now famous because it's in this book and it's all over the, my students, every now and then I'll walk into a classroom and my students will be looking at a website that has this picture. That's our teacher. It's very, very interesting. All right, anyway, so let me tell you a little bit more about these guys. They're relatively easy to work with. There's lots of different ways of capturing them. One of our favorite ways is just to bury a flower pot in the ground, and for a few days that works really well till they figure it out and they won't fall into it anymore. But in the meantime, they're really easy to catch because it takes a few moments to build a trap like that, and boom, you've got lizards. So even if your hand isn't steady enough to noose them, you can always do that, and I've taught lots of people how to do that. We also do it in using sticky sticky traps and other methods. They're relatively small lizards, easy to handle. This is actually a little bit smaller than the average adult size here, but they're completely diurnal, so that, they're only active in the daytime. They come from a family that doesn't even occur in the United States, so there are no close relatives to these guys in the United States. This is Lacertidae, and so I certainly have friends who will come here, and herpetologist friends who will come and see them. They come and they visit me. I take them out to a lizard site, and they say, okay, I can add a new family to the species I've seen, to my list of species that I've seen in North America, and so that's easy to do. So that's pretty cool. They used to be really common in the pet trade, not so much anymore. The reason they're here, of course, is that they used to be common in the pet trade. They are human commensals, so that means that in their native habitat, they are totally used to living alongside people in urban and suburban settings. So in Rome, you can go to the Colosseum and see wall lizards running on the rocks, 2,000-year-old rocks, 2,000-year-old ruins. They have been in Rome for in Italy, living with people for a long time. They are certainly pre-adapted to living in our suburbs and in our cities. So to give you a better idea, this is just Cicula's range. Muralis ranges over a much larger area than this, but Cicula's range is really all of Italy except for the most northern parts up here, and including the islands, and then of course all the small islands out here in the Mediterranean. This is a pretty diverse climatic range, but generally relatively warm and not getting too cold. Here in the United States, our little introduction of Cicula is not the only population in North America. The red dots here indicate all the Cicula introductions that we know about. There are probably more. But not only do we have one here in Long Island, there's also one in Connecticut. There used to be one in Philadelphia that looks like it's been extirpated, but there's a number of them now in southern New Jersey. There's one in Topeka, Kansas. There's one in Vancouver. And then Muralis, the sister species, has been introduced to at least 3 places. These are probably stepping stones that started here in Cincinnati, and then that went across to Kentucky, and the one in Indiana is probably a result of those first 2. And then this one is an entirely separate introduction from native stock in Italy. All of the Cicula populations that you see here are probably separate introductions from native stock from Italy, and then there's lots of secondary ones within those closer areas there. We do know a surprising amount about the introduction here on Long Island, because it was pretty well documented by a Cornell student who was a Long Island native who came home for the summer and needed a summer project in 1967. I'm sorry, in 1972, and he needed a summer project, and there were lizards running around, and so he said, "I'll do this," and so that's actually fairly well documented. And so this is a little fuzzy, but it's probably about right. It looks like they were introduced to Long Island in the Garden City area in 1967. Lots of stories about how it happened. I doubt whether we'll ever really know. They're now really common in lots of places across Long Island. I've certainly seen them all the way out on the South Fork, and every place in between. They're really common, and both in Nassau and Suffolk County. They are spreading a number of different ways. They are certainly moving along the railroad lines, so they're using the corridor associated with the Long Island Railroad, and people pick them up and move them deliberately all the time. It's really common, and people regularly call me up and say, "I just found a population here," and I look at what I know about them, and that's 30 miles past any other population that I know about. And if you look into it, almost always it's because somebody works in an area, or they play in an area that they visit an area where they're common. They thought they were cool. They grabbed a dozen of them. They put them in a new place. They let them go in their yard, their local park, whatever, and boom, we have a new population. They're now, I've lost track of how many places in New York City have them now. They're in Westchester County now. So these are all results of the original introduction here in 67. And there's no question that they will be every place on Long Island soon. In Italy, I saw them living on beaches and feeding on copepods. as the tide water moved in, as the waves moved in and out. So they certainly are completely well adapted to living on ocean fronts. They live in pine forests in Italy perfectly happily, and so I'm sure they will be able to colonize most of Suffolk County perfectly well. And then, as I said, all the way through Suburbia. So it's hard to imagine a habitat on Long Island that they will not be able to at least survive in, even if, and maybe thrive in as well. And I also want to point out that one of the reasons that they're so much fun to work with is because there's so many interesting they're so easy to work with in many ways. And this picture shows our way of marking individuals. If you want to do behavioral studies, it's relatively easy to get these guys and put them in a cooler with ice for 4 or 5 minutes. They chill down, they become completely insensitive, and they won't move anymore. And then you can actually sew little beads of different colored beads through some of the muscle in their tail there, and tie that off, and now you've got a long-term identification marker. And so if you want to know, if your males are moving around, if you want to know if how long they live, you want to do all those kind of things, and you're not going to keep recapturing them, then this is basically tagging like we do with birds. It's the same sort of thing. It works really well. All right, so when we first started this work, I was interested in learning something about basic natural history, because again, I knew those would be the publishable papers. But I was also interested in some of the bigger questions, like how they've adapted to the Long Island climate. No work had been done really on them at all, other than just a little bit of basic observations. And I was interested, again, in getting back at those questions that I brought up at the beginning about them as an invasive species. What kind of impact might they have there? In other words, should we be concerned about them? And should we be thinking about some sort of control measures? So to just give you kind of a list of the sorts of things of topics more specifically we're looking at, and I'm going to tell you about some of these. We were interested in their behavior patterns. We were interested in freeze tolerance to get at that, how do they live on Long Island. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about food habits and longevity and growth rates and genetics, and not necessarily in that order. And so those will be the things I'm going to focus on telling you about today. So, that didn't work quite right. I'm going to not tell it in the order that we did these projects. Actually, this project came up a little bit later. But one of the things that I really wanted to know was where they came from, right? So like I showed you in that picture of Italy, and you're supposed to see in this picture behind it here, is that they occur over all of Italy, including some of the islands. And we were really curious where in Italy our particular stock came from. They could have come from any place in Italy. Now, that's relevant because if I want to compare what our lizards are doing, if I want to compare their behavior, their reproduction, their longevity, any aspect of them, I really need to compare them to the lizards from the place where they came from. Because there's lots of reason to think that lizards in northern Italy are different from lizards in southern Italy. So years after I had actually started working lizards, I was able to go to Italy and spend some time just traveling around the countryside, stopping in towns and getting out and noosing lizards. And every time we noosed lizards, I'd take little tail samples, and in ways not too awfully different from what you heard about just a little while ago, we were able to take all those tail samples and do a within species phylogeny, and then determine which populations in Italy match up our populations along Long Island the best. We actually included some of those animals from Kansas and New Jersey as well. And what we found was that the animals from Long Island and the animals from Kansas both come from Florence, up in northern Italy. And I got to say, to one extent, I was a little bit disappointed because I really wanted them to be from Rome, because most of the work that's been done on these lizards in Italy, and there's not much, but the work that's been done on them in Italy has been done in Rome, so it would have made my life easier if they'd come from Rome. It would have made my comparisons sweeter. But the other part of it is, I loved Florence. Florence was so sweet. So the other part of me is very happy that they came from Florence. So this is an important part of what we did, and actually this is one of the later things that we got done. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about their behavior patterns. And this is something that occupied us quite a bit for the first couple of years that we were working on these guys. And as ectotherms, these guys, their lives are totally dependent on local temperature conditions. And we know that it affects many aspects of their lives in interesting and complicated ways. And herpetologists very often focus on temperature because, in a lot of times, that's where the action is. And I'm going to look at two aspects of their relationships with temperature. One of them is how temperature affects their behavior and the behavior patterns, and secondly, how they deal with the cold of the winter. So first I want to point out some differences between the climate in Florence, where they come from, and here on Long Island. So I'm going to do this in two ways. One is to look at average temperature, and that's something that we're pretty capable of imagining how that fits into things. And so if you look at average temperature on an annual scale comparing Florence to Long Island, you can see that our summers are pretty similar. Right? So summers here are awfully similar between here and Florence, but it's way different in the wintertime. And the difference, of course, is that we get a lot colder in the wintertime than it does in Florence. Now, that's true for average temperature, but any of the ecologists in the room will happily point out that average temperatures aren't what drive organisms to do what they do. What matters are the extremes, right? What happens when it gets really, really cold or really, really hot. Those are the events that change mortality, that affect mortality. That sort of thing. So if we look at extremes, Florence and Long Island are very different. Their highs, and these are the extreme minimums. And so in every single month, the coldest that Long Island gets is much colder than the coldest that Florence gets. And I'm going to particularly point out that our coldest, and these are 50-year minimums, so these are the coldest it got in a 50-year period. Our coldest, and this is in centigrade, our coldest is in January and in December, January, and February is way, way colder than the coldest that it gets in Florence. So if you think about this, what this means is that those lizards that were caught around Florence are transported to Long Island and probably released in the summertime. And the summer felt pretty good, right? It feels like home. I know how to deal with this. And then it gets colder and colder and colder as we're moving into fall and early winter. And I suspect they had a pretty rough surprise the first winter or two that they were here. So to talk a little, to see how that affected the lizards, I had an undergraduate student who lived in Garden City, where she had lizards all around her house and in her backyard and all that kind of thing. And so we wanted to replicate a study that was done in Rome. This is FOA's 1992 paper. We wanted to replicate a study in Rome where he basically walked through a graveyard where lizards were common day after day, all through a spring and summer, once a week he did this. And every time he did this, he counted how many lizards he saw. So this is technically pretty complicated, but we were pretty sure we could do that. And so, we did a layout of the pathway around the sidewalk of her house and around the garage and around the house, and so she walked this path once a week for the entire year. And this was her undergraduate research project. And she saw an average of 1.15 lizards on each time she did the run. And so, of course, sometimes she saw 0 when she did it in January, but other times in June or July she would see as many as 6. So she did 300 transects total, and she counted all the different lizards she saw, and she knew they were different because we marked them with the beads, like you saw in there. FOA didn't do that, but it's probably better so you don't double count the lizards. And so this was really interesting information. It compares in interesting ways with FOA, as you'll see next. So this is not temperature, but this is lizard activity. And so here, FOA's work was done in Rome, like I said before. Unfortunately, we don't have Florence data to compare it to, but Rome and Florence aren't too awfully different. And what you can see is that in the summertime, he had much higher density of lizards than we do, but he had a longer transect. He was working in better habitat. So I'm not concerned about the differences in density so much. That's going to happen. But what's more interesting is that he's got months when we basically saw none, right? We saw very few or no lizards whatsoever here, and he's got lizard activity here. So our lizards are down for the count, too cold to be up and about for months when lizards in Italy, at least some of them, are up and about. So that means on an annual basis, those lizards in Italy are up foraging and fighting and doing all that lizard stuff more months of the year than our lizards are. So our lizards are sleeping more of the year away. And if you look at it on a daily basis, and so she did some of these by going out every hour of the day, just like FOA did. If you do this on a daily basis, you can see that in Italy, in the mornings, you know, the lizards aren't up in the early morning, and then they get up sometimes about 8 o'clock. They hit the espresso machine, and they're up and about, and there's a fair number of lizards around. There's a little peak, right? You know, here in the spring, there's one peak toward a warm part of the day when the sun is hitting them just right. They're active until late afternoon, and then they're down again. And a very similar thing going on in fall. Right, so one peak up, you know, in the late morning, midday, and down for the fall, and we see a similar pattern, you know, qualitatively similar pattern here in New York. They're up around 10 o'clock. Let's see, that means they're hitting Starbucks here, and they're up about 10 o'clock, and they're active here. And again, you know, they've got one peak here in the fall. So qualitatively, these two patterns are very similar. And but in Italy, they're up earlier and go to bed later in the day. So similar to the annual pattern, we have a similar thing on a daily pattern. Our lizards are up and doing lizard things less of the day. So they spend fewer hours active. And then if you look at it in midsummer, we see something that's also very similar to Italy. We see the double peaks, right? So we see a morning activity period, it drops down. This is Italy data. Morning activity period and down and then back up again. And we see something similar here in New York. So, and that's very typical of lizards around the world. When they're in warm environments, they tend to do a morning activity period. They go to sleep during the hot part of the day, and then they get back up again in the cooler part of the late afternoon. So qualitatively, our lizards are doing pretty much the same sort of things as they did in Italy, but fewer hours a day. Fewer days of the year, fewer hours of the day. Okay, and then if you look at winter, even in January, in December and January, and December and February, other than January, the other two colder months of the year, there are lizards active in Italy on a pretty regular basis. And that's because their minimums and their averages are higher. So their temperatures are higher, so that means that lizards are better able to get up and about. So that means that, you know, even in the cold part of the year, their lizards are having at least some activity. We see nothing. Any of our lizards that would be up in that time of the year here in Long Island would be dead. Okay, so what we're seeing here, the general pattern is that, you know, we see the same activity patterns in a general sense, but that our animals are up and awake and doing things fewer days of the year and fewer hours of the day. All right, so the other aspect of temperature I wanted to address was freeze tolerance. And this had never been explored in this species before, but we do know that there are some close relatives to our Italian wall lizard, Ticicula, that actually are pretty tolerant of freezing. And one of those, this Lacerta here, you could freeze these guys solid, right? So no brain activity, no heart rate, everything is turned off. You can warm them back up again and they revive and they're perfectly okay. And this is obviously, they're adapted to living through very cold conditions this way. And even the sister species, Ticicula moralis, is pretty cold tolerant. And they can actually go down to -3 for up to just about 30 minutes and then bring them back up again and they're okay. Now, that's pretty exceptional for a small-bodied animal because at -3, they're freezing, right? They're starting to freeze. They don't freeze solid, but they start to freeze. And that's equivalent to one of us freezing our arms, all of our appendages, right? So being cold enough that your appendages freeze and then warming you back up again and you're okay. All right, so we did some supercooling, we did some freezing experiments with our lizards, and we find out that our lizards do not tolerate freezing whatsoever. If you get them very cold, they die. So that means that, I'm going to go a little bit faster because I'm running low on time, but what we definitely find is that they could supercool, they could get them down to about 4.8, but at about 4.8, they start freezing solid, and they quickly die after they start. So that means that our animals that are overwintering here in Long Island had to quickly figure out how to deal with that. That means they cannot survive freezing, and that means that they have to get below the frost line every winter. And how they learned to do that really quickly, since they probably didn't have to do that in Florence, I don't know. But here in Long Island, the frost line is about 24 centimeters. That's relatively deep. So somehow these lizards are regularly getting deep enough to avoid the freeze. I'm just going to zip through a couple of things pretty quickly here just to give you a flavor for some of the things that we've done. I was very interested in how this shortened activity period affected things like reproduction and longevity. So we've done some skeletal chronology on these guys, and that just means you take a cross-section of one of the toe bones and look at the development of rings. Lizards are great for this sort of thing, and you can identify annual rings, and this particular lizard was at least 6 years old. We've now got lizards that we know have that are at least 11 years old, and we can look at growth rates over that time period. So these are the number of, this is essentially age in years down here on the x-axis, and their body size here on the y-axis. Males and females have different growth rates, but they top off at about 74 millimeters, and our animals are living actually much longer than the Italian animals are. So our animals are growing more slowly, but they're living to a later age and actually reaching maturity at a later age than the Italian animals are, as you would probably expect. And then we actually have done quite a bit of diet stuff, and I just wanted to show you that they eat a lot of different things here on Long Island. So we looked at the diets of males and females, and they eat a lot of different things, but the important point is that what they're eating here is mostly non-native. They're living in people's gardens, they're living in suburbia, and so do lots of non-native inverts live in people's gardens and live in suburbia. So mostly what they're eating is stuff that is, like them, not native. So with that in mind, we've done some work looking at differences in diets in the males and the females. The males have bigger jaws, stronger jaws, and they eat harder things. They eat beetles a lot, whereas the females specialize more on things like aphids. But a lot of gardeners like them because they think they reduce the pests in their gardens. Not sure that's true, but they think they do, and so that, that seems fine. I'm going to zip through here, and I want to finish by pointing out that I'm also interested in what predation might be important to them. We know in Italy, in urban areas, cats are really important and eat a lot of them, and certainly in Italy, we saw cats carrying them around. That is not a cat carrying a wall lizard. I never got a good picture of a cat carrying one. We've seen lots of birds eating them here on Long Island. Mockingbirds eat them, almost certainly starlings eat them, but we also, and I hope that comes out okay, we were also able to document that kestrels eat them, and this is a picture from a pair in New York City. I didn't take this picture, but a group of people who were tracking this pair of birds caught it, and they sent me this picture and said, "Is that really a lizard? And if so, is that a wall lizard?" And that's a gravid female wall lizard, absolutely, no question about it. And interestingly enough, this same, kestrels, this same species, also occurs in Europe, and they eat wall lizards there. So it's like this species has passed on this knowledge. Oh, you know what? You can eat these guys and make a good living at it. This pair of birds took at least 40 lizards that the observers watched feeding over the course of one breeding season, and I never did find out where they were getting them from. I don't know of any populations within the normal range of the feeding range for these birds, and. I'm just going to say that I'm not going to talk about reproductive cycles or parasitology, which we've done a fair amount of work on, but I'm going to say thank you to all the people who actually did all the real work with this, and if I have any time, I'll be happy to take questions.
We do have a little bit of time. You can have, Daniel Karkin, you can have enough heat next to a foundation.
Of course.
Just under a wood pile, under leaves, under some brush, that they might be able to survive that way without having to bury themselves deep in the ground.
Yeah, and certainly we've thought about that, and it's interesting that nobody has good temperature data like that would address that. For example, I found that nobody has done the simple thing of putting temperature loggers along the side of a foundation of a building to see how much insulation that provides. I mean, we'll get to that.
I can tell you that at my house with concrete foundation, snow never stays there. It just melts immediately next to the foundation, under leaves. There's more than enough heat coming out that if they want to hide there, they're more than welcome. Fortunately, Fortunately, I don't have any lizards in my house.
Yeah, and I hear people say that a lot. Unfortunately, I don't have lizards, and I know what the next thing is where can I get them?
Hi.
I don't move lizards. I don't encouraging the movement of the lizards. I don't have to. It's happening all by itself. I don't need to.
I do energy conservation engineering, and that's why I know what the temperature gradients are with regard to foundation walls. There's always enough heat outside a foundation wall that it's going to be near or above 32 degrees.
Good to know.
Hi, thank you. I was pretty excited to find a dead one on the railroad tracks in Riverhead. I'm sure you're familiar with the aquarium population.
I am indeed.
And I heard the pet store over there and perhaps was where they were escaped from, but I was not...
I heard another story, but we can talk
Okay.
about that later.
Yeah, my main thing is I was not as excited to discover them in Hubbard County Park, actually. And I was wondering, this is Pine Barrens, pretty much
Sure.
county park land. I also know that's like the highest density of maybe Lone Star ticks and other species. And could you please, I know you didn't, and you pointed it out, the parasitology, but can you maybe just comment on some possibilities of tick ecology, relationship
Sure.
with them with tick ecology and what the implications of that, please?
Absolutely. So first place is like many invasives, there's probably nothing we can do about it. I mean, you could slow them down, but you couldn't stop them. So if they were in a place that you didn't want them, you can just moan about it because there's not much else you can do. But as far as ticks are concerned, there's a number of interesting directions to take there. But in Italy, these lizards, both Sicula and Muralis, are hosts to a different Ixodes tick. So the same genus but different species of the deer ticks that we have here. And they have Lyme in Italy, and it's passed by this Ixodes tick, just like our Lyme is passed by our Ixodes tick. It's not as prevalent in the human population, and it's not as big a concern, but it is a pretty significant concern. It looks like these lizards, as other lizards are Lyme incompetent. And by that I mean that when they're bitten by a tick that has Lyme, they don't get infected, and they're unable to pass it on to additional ticks that might bite them later. These lizards do host these ticks, and they're probably play at least some role, and maybe a major role, in breaking the chain of ticks that are infected with Borrelia. This is really unexplored, and we've done a little bit of work in my lab with this. We have found out that the local Ixodes, our deer ticks, don't go on these lizards very readily. The southern if you look at the same ticks in the southern part of the United States, the deer ticks, our deer ticks from the southern part of the United States, they readily feed on lizards, but they don't like Italian wall lizards, from what we've seen so far. We're going to redo those experiments this next coming summer, and I hope to know a lot more about it. But as these guys spread out into tick areas, they may play a role in affecting Lyme prevalence.